The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the bedside lamp and the cold blue light of her phone screen. She stood before the mirror, the striped tank top clinging to her form, her hand holding the phone to obscure her face. It wasn't vanity that compelled her to take the selfie, but a curious kind of discontent she couldn't name, as if capturing the moment might explain the unease settling in her chest. Emma glanced at the reflection behind her. The unmade bed, the shelves lined with forgotten books, and a half-closed door that hinted at the rest of the house. Mundane details of a shared space that now felt heavy with expectation. She hesitated before snapping the photo, debating whether to send it to anyone. There was no one waiting for it, no one she wanted to see it. Yet, the act itself felt like a small rebellion against the stifling predictability of her life. The door creaked open, breaking her thoughts. She spun around quickly, lowering her phone, her heart skipping a beat. "Didn't mean to scare you," a voice said casually. It was him, Jason, her stepbrother. He leaned against the doorframe, his presence as nonchalant as always, but there was something in his eyes that seemed to linger longer than usual. His dark hair was tousled, as though he'd just woken up from a nap, and his shirt hung loosely on his broad shoulders. "You didn't scare me," she replied, her voice sharper than intended. She turned back to the mirror, pretending to adjust her tank top, but her hands felt clumsy, unsteady. Jason stepped inside the room without invitation, moving with the kind of ease that came from years of living under the same roof. "Didn't realize you were still up," he said, his tone light. Emma shrugged, catching his reflection in the mirror as he approached. "Couldn't sleep again?" he asked, his brows furrowing slightly. He sat down on the edge of her bed, his weight causing the mattress to dip. "You've been saying that a lot lately. What's on your mind?" The question hung in the air, too direct, too probing. Emma avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the way her phone case gleamed under the light. "Nothing. Just stuff. You know how it is." Jason chuckled softly. "Not really. You're always so cryptic." His voice carried an easy warmth, but there was an undercurrent to it tonight, a weight she couldn't ignore. Emma finally turned to face him, leaning against the dresser. "What do you want, Jason?" He raised his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, I'm not here to bother you. Just heard you moving around and thought I'd check in." Emma crossed her arms, unsure whether his concern was genuine or another one of his attempts to needle her. Their relationship had always been complicated, never hostile but filled with moments that hovered on the edge of something undefined. It was a fine line they walked, one made all the more precarious by the circumstances that had brought them together. "Thanks, but I'm fine," she said, her tone clipped. Jason didn't move. Instead he studied her, his gaze searching. "You don't look fine," he said softly. Emma felt her cheeks flush under his scrutiny. She hated how easily he could unsettle her, how his presence could fill the room and leave her feeling exposed. She turned back to the mirror, trying to mask her unease. "Don't you have anything better to do?" she asked, her voice laced with annoyance. Jason smirked, leaning back on his hands. "Not really. You're way more interesting than whatever's on TV." His words were teasing, but there was a flicker of something else, something that made her pulse quicken. She glanced at him over her shoulder, her expression guarded. "You're impossible, you know that." "And yet, here I am," he replied smoothly. The tension in the room was palpable now, a silent current running between them. Emma felt it in the way he watched her, in the way her own breath seemed to catch whenever his voice dipped lower. She hated herself for noticing, for letting her thoughts drift to places they shouldn't. "I should go to bed," she said abruptly, turning away from him. Jason didn't move. "You're not great at lying, you know." She froze, her hand resting on the edge of the dresser. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," he said, standing and closing the distance between them, "you're not fine and you don't want to go to bed. So why don't you just tell me what's really going on?" His proximity was disarming. Emma felt her pulse race, her mind scrambling for a way to deflect. "Why do you care?" Jason's expression softened, his usual smirk replaced by something quieter, more sincere. "Because I do," he said simply. The words hung in the air, heavier than she expected. Emma turned to face him fully, her arms still crossed as if they could shield her from whatever was happening between them. "You shouldn't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe not. But here we are." The room felt too small, the air too thick. Emma looked away, her heart pounding in her chest. "You should go," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Jason hesitated, his hand twitching as if he might reach for her, but he didn't. Instead, he stepped back, the distance between them suddenly vast. "Good night, Emma," he said, his voice low. She didn't respond, didn't look at him as he walked out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. When she finally let out the breath she'd been holding, Emma turned back to the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, the same face, the same striped tank top, but everything else felt different. She picked up her phone again, her fingers trembling as she opened the camera. The image on the screen captured her and the door behind her, now firmly shut. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left open, something she couldn't close. Emma set the phone down, the photo unsent, and climbed into bed. But sleep didn't come. It wouldn't. Not with Jason's words echoing in her mind and the weight of his gaze still lingering in the room. The morning sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting long, slanted shadows across the floor. Emma sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring a mug of coffee that had long since gone lukewarm. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of wood settling and the faint hum of a refrigerator. She liked mornings like this, peaceful, predictable, and undisturbed. But that peace shattered the moment Jason walked in. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying a casual familiarity as he strolled to the counter. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, and his hair still had the telltale disarray of sleep. Emma didn't look up. "Morning." Jason poured himself a cup of coffee, then leaned against the counter, watching her. "You look like you didn't sleep much." She bit the inside of her cheek, annoyed at how easily he could read her. "I slept fine." "Liar," he said, smirking as he took a sip. She finally glanced up, her eyes narrowing. "What do you want, Jason?" "Right now." "Coffee," he said, lifting his mug slightly as if to toast her. Then after a pause he added, "But later. I'm thinking a run." "Wanna join me?" Emma scoffed. "Since when do you run?" "Since now," he replied smoothly. "I figured you'd want some fresh air after last night." Her cheeks burned at the mention, though he hadn't said anything overt. It was the weight behind his words, the unspoken acknowledgement of their late-night conversation, that made her heart race. "I'm busy," she said quickly, though she had no plans for the day. Jason raised an eyebrow, his smirk deepening. "Busy doing what?" "Brooding over cold coffee." She glared at him but didn't respond. He chuckled and pushed off the counter, walking toward her. "Come on, Emma. You're wound tighter than a spring. A run'll do you good." His persistence was infuriating, but it was the glint of something else in his eyes, something she couldn't name, that made her stomach flip. "Fine," she said, standing abruptly. "But don't expect me to wait for you if you can't keep up." Jason grinned. "Wouldn't dream of it." The trail was quiet, their footsteps crunching against the gravel in a steady rhythm. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. Emma kept her focus ahead, determined not to let Jason's presence distract her, but it was impossible to ignore him entirely. He jogged beside her with ease, his strides long and measured. Occasionally he glanced over at her, a teasing smile playing at his lips. "You're doing great," he said after a while, his tone dripping with mock encouragement. Emma rolled her eyes. Shut up. He laughed, the sound warm and unguarded. It was one of the things she hated about him, or maybe admired. Jason never seemed to take anything too seriously, and it was infuriating how effortless he made it seem. They reached a clearing by the edge of the trail, a small grassy area overlooking the lake. Emma stopped, catching her breath as she rested her hands on her knees. Jason came to a halt beside her, barely winded. "Not bad," he said, nodding in approval. "I'm impressed." "Don't be," she muttered, straightening up. Jason looked out at the lake, his expression softening. "It's nice out here," he said. "Quiet. Feels like the kind of place where you can just let go." Emma followed his gaze, the stillness of the water reflecting the sky above. "Yeah," she said softly, though her mind was far from quiet. Jason turned to her, his eyes searching her face. "What's going on with you, Emma? Really?" She stiffened, her defenses rising immediately. "Why do you keep asking me that?" "Because I can see it," he said, his voice steady. "You're not yourself lately. And I know it's not just the usual stuff." Emma clenched her fists, unsure whether she was more angry at him for prying or at herself for wanting to tell him. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" he said, taking a step closer. The distance between them was almost non-existent now, and Emma's breath hitched. She looked away, but Jason didn't move. "Emma," he said softly, his voice a mix of concern and something deeper. "Don't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why not?" he asked, his tone quiet but insistent. "Because this is wrong," she said, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, and her chest ached with the weight of everything she couldn't say. Jason reached out, his hand hovering just inches from hers. "Maybe," he said. "But that doesn't mean it's not real." The words struck her like a thunderclap, breaking through every wall she'd carefully built. She wanted to tell him to stop, to leave, to never speak of this again, but she couldn't. The truth was too raw, too undeniable. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world around them seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of their breaths and the pounding of her heart. Then, as if pulled by an unseen force, Jason closed the remaining distance. His hand brushed against hers, a simple touch that felt like an earthquake. Emma didn't pull away. "Jason," she said, her voice barely audible. He leaned in, his eyes locked on hers. "Say the word," he whispered, "and I'll stop." Emma's mind screamed at her to push him away, to end this before it began, but her body refused to move. Instead, she closed her eyes, letting the moment consume her. When his lips met hers, it was both a shock and a release. The kiss was tentative at first, as though testing the limits of what was allowed. But when Emma responded, the dam broke. Every unspoken word, every buried feeling, every ounce of tension that had built between them poured out in that single reckless act. When they finally pulled apart, the reality of what they'd done settled over them like a heavy fog. Emma stared at him, her lips still tingling, her heart racing. "This doesn't change anything," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Jason smiled faintly, his gaze steady. "Doesn't it?" Emma turned away, unable to face the questions in his eyes, or the answers in her own heart. As they made their way back to the house, the silence between them was deafening. But even in that silence, the bond they'd crossed into was unbreakable, and both knew there was no going back. The house was cloaked in the heavy stillness of late afternoon. Emma sat alone in the living room, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound breaking the silence. She stared blankly at the television, its muted screen flickering with images she wasn't watching. Her thoughts were a chaotic tangle, looping endlessly back to the kiss by the lake. She'd told herself it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment born out of confusion and exhaustion. But no matter how many times she repeated the lie, her body betrayed her. Her lips still tingled with the memory of Jason's, and her heart raced at the thought of him. The sound of footsteps on the stairs jolted her from her reverie. She tensed as Jason appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes locking on hers before stepping inside. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but low. Emma looked away, pretending to adjust a throw pillow on the couch. "There's nothing to talk about." "Don't do that," he said, moving closer. "Don't shut me out." She scoffed, still avoiding his gaze. "What do you want me to say, Jason? That it was a mistake? That it shouldn't have happened?" "Was it a mistake?" he asked, his tone soft but unyielding. Her head snapped up, and for a moment she was struck by the intensity in his eyes. It wasn't the teasing, carefree gaze she was used to. It was raw, vulnerable, and searching. "Yes," she said firmly, though the word felt like sandpaper against her tongue. "It was." Jason's jaw tightened, and he ran a hand through his hair. "You don't believe that," he said. "I have to," she shot back, her voice rising. "Because if I don't, then what does that make me? What does that make us?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with accusation and anguish. Jason stepped closer, his movements deliberate, as if trying not to spook her. "It makes us honest," he said. Emma laughed bitterly. "Honest? This isn't honesty, Jason. It's wrong." He knelt down in front of her, his hands resting on the edge of the couch, inches from hers. "Maybe it is," he said quietly. "But it's also real. And you know it." Her throat tightened and she looked away, her vision blurring with unshed tears. "What are we supposed to do?" she whispered. Jason's hand moved tentatively, brushing against hers. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know that pretending it didn't happen isn't the answer." She pulled her hand away, standing abruptly. "You don't get it, do you? If anyone finds out—" "They won't," he interrupted, his voice firm. "This stays between us." Emma paced the room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "It doesn't matter, Jason. We'll know. You'll know. And it'll ruin everything." "It doesn't have to," he said, standing. She turned to face him, her eyes blazing. "How can you say that? We can't just go back to the way things were." "Maybe not," he said, his tone calm despite the storm brewing between them. "But we can figure it out. Together." Emma shook her head, frustration and fear warring within her. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," he admitted. "But it's worth it." His words stopped her in her tracks. She searched his face for any sign of hesitation or doubt, but all she found was certainty. Terrified her. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason nodded. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." She wanted to believe him, wanted to let herself fall into the safety of his promise. But the weight of what they'd done and what it could mean was too much to ignore. The following days passed in a haze of avoidance and stolen glances. Emma buried herself in mundane tasks, desperate for distraction, but Jason's presence was a constant reminder of the line they'd crossed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Emma found herself drawn back to the lake. She sat by the water's edge, hugging her knees to her chest, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. She didn't hear Jason approach until he was standing beside her. He didn't say anything, just sat down next to her, his shoulder barely touching hers. "I thought you'd want to be alone," he said after a while. "I did," she admitted. "But it didn't help." Jason nodded, his gaze fixed on the water. "Same here." For a moment they sat in silence, the sounds of the lake filling the space between them. "I don't know how to move forward," Emma said quietly. Jason turned to her, his expression serious. "We take it one step at a time. And we don't let anyone else decide what this means for us." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Emma's chest ache. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for the truth. "And if it all falls apart," she asked. "Then at least we'll know we tried," he said. Emma let out a shaky breath, her resolve crumbling. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," he said. "But I'm here." The sun disappeared completely, leaving the lake bathed in twilight. And for the first time in days, Emma felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, tentative thing, but enough to hold on to. As they sat together, their hands intertwined, the future stretched out before them, uncertain but theirs to navigate.